I guess the first thing to note is that our podcast is now online and available for people to subscribe to and find in iTunes, and it's got a website that you can go to, spinnerproof.com, and you posted those first few episodes on the Robot Wars subreddit, which is quite funny.
It's been a long road to publishing this, hasn't it? Because we got stuck in Twitter verification hell for a good long time.
We got stuck in, well, you got stuck in verification hell for both the Twitter account and our email account.
Yeah, everything just broke. It was awful. It's been very stressful.
All a nightmare. And then I didn't realise how much of a pain submitting to iTunes would be. Not a pain, but like how time consuming, even that's not right, but how long it might take for that to be approved. So with the iTunes submission process, you've got to have a RSS feed that conforms to their way of doing RSS feeds, and you've got to have a logo that's the right size. Ours originally was too small, and then it's got to be reviewed by a human when you submit it to them. So I submitted it to them, sort of expecting that to be it, and then I got an email being like, it's now in review and we'll let you know when it's approved. And then I did a bit of searching around, and people say it could take 3 weeks for that to happen. I was like, oh god. But thankfully it only took a day, so we're all right.
I wonder if that person, that human at iTunes, realised what a privileged position they were in. Because, we hadn't sent this out to anyone before then. I think a lot of times when people submit to iTunes, they've sort of been distributing some other way. But they were the first person to listen to us talking about a programme that odds are they don't watch.
But yeah, it's there. It's available to be listened to, and you can... we've got a Twitter account. Isn't that exciting?
Sam, what is our Twitter account?
God damn it, man. I walked... I don't know why I carried on. I should have just stopped. Our Twitter account is at Spinnerproof, I believe. Yes, it must be. At Spinnerproof.
There, you did Twitter plugging.
I've done Twitter plugging. Now can we move on?
I owe just the world an apology for episode 3 and my audio. I made a very silly mistake that I'm not going to make again, and it sounded awful. And I just want everyone to know how very, very sorry I am.
I'm the one that should be apologising because mine is consistently rubbish as opposed to just rubbish for one episode.
That's the thing, we sort of addressed this before. I'm sat here in a proper recording studio, and I can't get my audio right. You're laid in bed and you can. What
will be interesting is if my audio quality is still better than yours this time, because I'm recording on an iPad. I don't even have a proper computer this time.
I think my audio is going to be pretty much perfect today. I'm going to put that out there right now.
I'm glad. I look forward to the follow-up next week on that. Or next time on that. I'm going to stop saying next week, because it's not going to be a weekly podcast.
This is the point, I suppose, where we now go through and correct every single mistake we've made in the course of the podcast so far.
Maybe not every single mistake, but I'm going to jump in and I want to correct you in your memory. That's what I want to do. I want to have the satisfaction of doing this. In the last episode, you claimed that Storm 2 rammed iron ore out of the arena, and you're wrong.
I'm okay with this mistake, but carry on.
Storm 2 threw Steel Avenger out of the arena with ramming speed alone.
I think I did very well to correctly identify that it was one of the many robots with a ferrous metal in their name. I'm completely okay with this.
I mean, you remembered a lot more of it than me. I mean, I only know this because I went and looked it up just on the off chance that I could correct you when I was editing. So
I choose to believe that you've done that a lot of times already. And this is the first one that came off.
No, this is the first time I've bothered to actually go and do research on the things that you've claimed, so...
See, this is one of the things you have to accept when you're doing a podcast. We're going to be wrong about a lot of stuff.
Oh, yes.
Most of it we're not even going to realise.
We're going to be wrong, primarily because neither of us are qualified for talking about this.
Technically, you're the most qualified, because you at least know how electronics work.
Yeah, I have half a degree in this. I should be fine.
I've just watched Robot Wars obsessively for many years. That's all I've got.
I feel like obsessively is an understatement.
I've been thinking a lot about Foxic this week. I think a lot about Foxic every week. I love Foxic. And I was determined that I was going to go out and, trawl YouTube for a couple of minutes and triumphantly send you footage of Foxic winning a fight.
I'm going to go... based on the fact that I have received no such links, that you didn't have much success with that.
As far as I can tell, there is no video evidence of Foxic ever winning a fight.
It's because it's a rubbish robot.
It's a good robot that hasn't had luck. Bear in mind, in all seriousness, people could have easily said that about Razer after their first couple of series. because they kept breaking down. But it was a very good robot, and it came good in the end. I really think Foxic will do the same. And I know that I'm fairly sure it has won some fights as well. They're just not ones that have been recorded.
Well, when I see it win a fight, I will reevaluate. Well, yeah, I'll reevaluate my position on it, but I still don't like it.
Series 15, that's Foxic's year, I've decided.
Series 15. I guess moving on with the follow. I mean, I've just got some like facts and figures and numbers to really sort of just correct myself on, and then I feel like you've probably got expansions on topics, so I might just go power through my list quickly.
Go ahead.
In the last episode, we were talking about tungsten axes. And you mentioned that osmium might be denser than tungsten, and I wasn't sure. I've looked it up. Osmium has a density of 22.59 grams per centimetre cubed, and tungsten is a mere 19.25 grams per centimetre cubed, so osmium is indeed the denser material, so it would be
I believe osmium is the densest element that isn't down in the UUs.
Yes, it is the densest metallic element, so there's that. And then in more of a correction than a clarification, I said that a 1 centimetre cube of tungsten weighed about a kilogram, and I am very, very wrong. It's about 1.5 inches cubed, which is about 3.8 centimetres cubed, is a kilogram of tungsten. It's still ridiculously dense, but that's what it is. 3.8 centimetres cubed.
That's it. Pull the podcast. We can't have it out there.
That's rubbish. And also, in slightly more petty things, in the armchair engineering section, I said microchip when what I should have said is microcontroller.
I'm so glad we cleared that up, because I guarantee everyone was raging.
Well, I was beyond disappointed with myself when I heard it, so I just wanted to get that out there. So that's it. That's my fault. Those are the corrections that I wanted to make from the last episode.
I suppose the final thing from me is that in this episode today, I am going to be the most critical of a robot I will ever be.
What? I'm excited about this, man. What robot is worthy of that for you?
Oh, you'll see. But I do find myself in follow-up every time I want to sort of argue against things you've said against robots. And today, the thing for that is with concussion. Because you were talking about the tendency that a lot of teams have, it's not just them, to sort of, I don't know the correct terminology for this, so excuse me, but putting more power through their motors than they're rated for. Now, my understanding is that the only downside of that is that they will heat up more quickly than if you put a normal amount of current through them.
It's a pretty big downside.
But in a 3-minute fight, that doesn't seem unmanageable. And this is something that Tornado did for years very effectively. So I don't see the big problem you've got with it.
So overdriving or overvolting your motors can be done, and it can be done safely and effectively. But in these last 2 series, and we're going to talk about this a lot today, so many robots have problems because they push their robots or push the motors or the speed controllers too hard, and then they burn them out in the fight. Which is why I really think you shouldn't do it unless you really know what you're doing, unless you've got extra heat sinks on those motors, unless you've got a speed controller that can definitely handle that current, unless all of the whole electronics pipeline can deal with it, don't do it.
It can't be a decision that teams are making lightly. They've got to know those downsides, and they must have decided that the upside is worth it.
Yeah, I guess so.
Anything you're doing is kind of an opportunity cost kind of thing, isn't it? It's a cost benefit kind of thing. So they've obviously made that decision. If they were going out there and going, what is this? I appear to be smoking, and we're all surprised about it, then I'd understand the sort of, it's not even the criticism really, it's just, I think there's almost a sort of accusation of amateurishness that was kind of implied in what you've said a few times about this, when I think actually it's a conscious decision that they're aware of the risks of.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, I'm sure it is. I'm sure you're right that it is a conscious decision. The thing is, it seems like an amateur mistake to me. That's the thing, because for me, and I wouldn't do it for exactly this reason, and because I've never competed in Robot Wars, and I know, or don't know, but I wouldn't do that. I feel like the people that do compete in robots would definitely know that and shouldn't do it. But who knows? Maybe if and when I build one of these robots, I will understand why they do it and do it myself. But I doubt it, especially not after complaining about it so much in public. I'm kind of committed to staying within design limits now.
I think a truly great man would admit he was wrong if necessary. I'm not saying you are, but if that came up, I think you'd acknowledge it.
If it came to the point where I couldn't build a competitive robot without overdriving motors, I would throw my hands in the air, admit to the world that I was wrong, and overdrive my motors. But But anyway, I think we will probably come back to this. Well, we'll definitely come back to this a bit later on. So should we move on?
Let's get into this first melee.
In melee 1, we have Supernova, Frostbite, Worm, and High Five. Shall we start with Supernova? Spinner!
Supernova is a robot that I have just always liked, and I don't quite understand why.
Because it's an excellent robot, that's why.
Well, that's a good reason, yeah. As a sort of Hypnodisc fanboy, I suppose anyone that came in and improved on that design, I was instantly going to like. But there's just something about the look of it, the shape of it, that I've always really enjoyed.
I love the way it turns. I just, when it's turning on the spot, I always expect it to rotate around a point along its back axle, but it doesn't. It rotates almost perfectly around the axle for the spinning disc, and it's amazing.
I had never noticed that.
Oh, you should go and watch that. It looks so cool when it does it, because the back almost just magically slides around. I have no idea.
So it's kind of drifting.
Yeah, I have no idea how they do it, but it's amazing.
I was really upset when they went out last year, especially the way they went out. You know, basically just gyro dancing into the pit. They've made big improvements to the disc. So last time round, they kind of suffered because some teeth came off. That was the start of the gyro dancing issues. This time it's now one solid chunk of metal, and boy, does it look beautiful.
It does look good. I do like it, yeah. It passes my bar for being aesthetically pleasing.
That's all it needs, really. The one thing I would say with the design is that I'm not sure that being that narrow is necessarily a good thing for it. I think that's unhelpful if they do get into a sort of bout of gyroscopic precession. I wonder if a slightly wider stance would make it that little bit more controllable in those situations. But that's a very minor criticism.
Yeah, I think the other thing that would help is to not... It looks to me like the disc is at a slight angle downwards, because it's not the same height across the whole length of the robot. So I think the disc is angled ever so slightly downwards, which I wonder if that introduces slight problems with gyro precession as well. But they seem to have it under control in this whole thing. They always seem like they were, ignoring a lack of control just after hitting something. They always seem to be in control of what their robot was doing. So
I think it also helps that it's not that quick or nippy. It's quite an easy robot to control and drive. The other thing I would say about it is that it is quite lightweight. It's 15 kilos underweight. And you do wonder if they could invest that into maybe a bit more on the weapon, maybe a bit more armour. It seems odd to go in underweight in any circumstances.
Maybe they could invest in a clutch as well.
Yes, chain drive. This is interesting.
Yeah, chain-driven spinner connected directly, it seems, to the motor with no indirection there at all. Like could do with like a clutch or something above the disc, maybe to allow the motor to spin a little bit
Surely they've got some kind of clutch system in there. Surely. That seems like just Spinner 101.
I would have thought so, but their chain did break quite a lot, so...
I think that was more to do with possibly tension issues, but I'm not sure on that. Don't quote me on that. I'd be really surprised if, after 3 or 4 revisions to this robot, they'd not put something in like a clutch or gone to belt drive or something like that. But maybe they have. Maybe that's a thing that happened. Who knows?
Up next, we have Frostbite, a bar spinner.
Yeah, I foreshadowed this, didn't I?
Is this the one you didn't like?
Yes. I think it might be good to hear your opinion first, but just know that I'm very prepared with quite a long rant about why I don't like this robot.
That is interesting. I'm sort of looking through the other ones that are in this thing, and I guess that's the one that makes the most sense.
You know what? I'm just going to go for it. And I'm going to sort of preface this by saying that I don't feel good about what I'm about to say. In a way, I don't want to say any of it, but because I seem to view myself as some deliverer of verbal justice, I feel like I have to put this opinion out there. Frostbite is probably the only entry in this series that I would happily say I hate.
Wow.
And that's not hate in the sort of funny haha hyperbole way. I properly hate it. And it's not because of the robot itself, and it's not because of the ting. It's because of one incident with them that I think is completely inexcusable. If you get a chance to go on the Kingswood School YouTube channel, you will see a couple of testing videos for Frostbite.
Okay.
Where they have got the weapons spun up in a classroom, and they are stood just a little bit away from it with no proper protection.
Oh my god.
Now, Frostbite isn't the most powerful weapon in the competition. If anything, it's probably one of the least powerful, definitely of the spinners. And I can understand why someone would look at that and go, I am comfortable standing quite near this. I understand why you would do that in your garden. As someone who's worked in education for a very long time, the fact that someone thinks they can do that in school with a bunch of kids astounds me.
That is shocking.
The fact that in a school, you have got to write a risk assessment to walk to a building down the road. And yet there they are, not only doing this, but putting it online and keeping it there. That video's been up for a long time. It's just absolute madness to me. And again, the kids in this team I think are great. And I have no problem with them whatsoever. They're getting a chance to do a really cool thing. And the adult in charge is saying this is fine. So of course they're going to go along with that. They're 13 years old. That's fine. But to watch a teacher do that is madness to me. I absolutely love that schools get involved with Robot Wars. And I want that to keep going. But imagine what it would do. You know, imagine being a head teacher in a school and you've got one of your technology teachers coming along and saying, hey, can I get a bit of budget to build a robot and try and enter Robot Wars? That's already a potentially difficult sell. If that head teacher has that request come and they open the newspaper and they see a story about how 3 kids got hurt building a robot in their school, how many schools are going to get involved after that? It's just absolutely... And I feel like... I worry that I'm oversensitive to this, but to me it is absolutely disgusting. And I'm gonna regret having said this and putting it out there because I am wording this maybe a little bit more strongly than I should, but that is how I feel about it. And of course the BBC aren't responsible for what happens when teams are building stuff. But I do worry that by putting them on the show, they've kind of given tacit approval of that behaviour.
I don't know that the BBC have given any kind of approval of that, tacit or otherwise, simply because you wouldn't know that from watching the TV program, and very, very few, like a vanishingly small percentage of their audience goes and does podcasts about them, for example. I will say I completely agree with you and everything you've just said. Using any weapon in any room where there's no protection between you and it is stupid. It is doubly stupid to be the responsible adult doing that with school children. It is horrifying to me that that's happened. I'm very glad that nothing went wrong, but if it did go wrong, then it's just inexcusable.
It's really funny because I'm sat here saying all this when during my career in education I have constantly moaned about safety standards being too draconian. But on this one, I feel like I'm kind of justified. Health
and safety in the UK is a bit insane, but then there's, insane health and safety stuff, and then there's, a home-built robot spinning up in a classroom with kids around. It's just, especially one with a spinning weapon. I mean, even doing something like testing an axe, I think would be a bit foolish, but robots with spinning weapons, they are really hard to test because when they go wrong, they go wrong. And, if that bar falls apart or comes off in any way, that's really, really dangerous. So they are hard to test, and they're hard to... I mean, I can understand why you did. So Supernova mentioned that the only place they can safely test their weapon at full speed is in the arena. They don't have access to anywhere where they've got that kind of, really thick perspex or like bullet-resistant material stuff to absorb that energy. And I certainly wouldn't have access to that. I can't think of anywhere I'd even go to start looking for access to that kind of stuff to do it. But yeah, I agree with you. It's terrible. That's foolish from the teacher, if nothing else.
Yeah, I don't like talking about individuals and criticising them in general, but especially on here. But that one, I feel I had to. I'm also just going to point out, because I have just quickly gone online to see if the video was still there and all of that, I may have accidentally smeared the wrong school there. It's Kingston, not Kingswood. Kingswood, I think, is a local school that I quite like, so I feel a bit bad now. So consider that corrected.
Kingston upon Thames is the school they came from.
That would be the one, yes.
Well, my complaints of this robot are not nearly as extreme. They are much more focused on the technical merits of the build.
I have that too. It's fine.
It is a weak robot with rubbish armor. The guy claimed that there's never been a plastic robot for £500 that's lifted the trophy, or words to that effect.
He's not wrong. Can't argue with that.
It's one of those things where that is technically true because of all the qualifiers, but I'm just sort of thinking Chaos 2 was a cheap robot and it won. Like, that was 250 quid, I think, the first one of those. I'm fairly sure I'm right in saying that. And then there are other cheap robots that have done very well in robots, most notably, to me anyway, 101, which cost £101.
Well, they claim 101 pence, but we know that's not true.
Oh, 101 pence. Okay, I'm sorry.
That was a really good case of someone using materials they already had around.
Yeah.
And a lot of teams do that really well. Obviously, if you're a school, that's a bit harder. But
to build a robot for 500 quid is impressive, but I think it's a bit much to go claiming that no one else I mean, I guess he's not technically claiming that no one else has done it, but it's awfully close.
I say, his facts are correct. It's whether his interpretation of those facts is valid.
Technically correct. The best kind of correct.
What I like is, as a budget build, they haven't made terrible design decisions. So they've chosen to build big and basically use the air gap as a bit of protection, which is fair enough. I would, however, question the idea of making a spinner on a budget. There are lots of things you can make on a budget and do a decent job. I think a spinner is probably the hardest of the lot. Make an electric lifter, do what Jellyfish did and do a kind of control bot. They're all really strong options that you can do effectively and cheaply.
Yes, Jellyfish, the shining example here.
What they've done was not going to be effective.
No. Yeah, I agree. You can't do a spinner. Well, until proven otherwise, you can't do a spinner on the cheap. I think you're right. I think probably an electric lifter is probably a good starting point for that kind of thing, I would say.
I did try to find a weight on the bar. I'm hearing 4 kilos, which is, it's not quite the 38 we've got claimed by another robot in this episode, you know? It's quite lightweight.
They should have built it out of tungsten.
In fairness, they've got it spinning up to a decent rate. 2,000 RPM on it. That's not terrible. I'm sweaty. I need to calm down.
So angry. Well, should we calm down and talk about worm? What I learned with this one, by the way, is it's really hard to say the phrase lifting wedge in a menacing sounding way. The guy
lifting wedge.
The guy couldn't do it. It sounds ridiculous. Lifting wedge. It just doesn't work. Anyway, these are the guys that built that wooden robot last year.
Good old Overdoser. That's a budget build. That's a budget build I can get behind.
And they've come back with a metal robot with a spinner killer front wedge, which ostensibly lifts. But again, I never saw it happen. This is like Foxic. This just seems to be really testing the limits of active weapon and building a.
It definitely moves.
Building a push bot. Yeah, but like we never saw it move. At least I don't think so.
It only moves under the robot and stops it working. That's all it seemed to do.
Yeah, I just feel like, this and Foxic and what was it? Was it Aftershock in the last series? All sort of testing the limits of active weapon just to build a push bot, which is what it is. I think the BBC should just allow push bots, but there you go.
Well, yeah, that would be the easy way forward.
Indeed.
The thing I really love with Worm and Team Memento Mori in general is that we're kind of getting to watch their evolution as builders. So they came in with something that was objectively rubbish, and they've come along with an improved concept.
They've improved on objectively rubbish.
Give them 10 years, they'll be winning the thing,
They've upgraded to objectively a bit rubbish.
You see, again, if you're making a budget build, the design that you choose counts for a lot. And the concept of their design is really good. So we've both watched BattleBots, we've both seen Sewer Snake. Well, sorry, it's Stinger on there. Sewer Snake is the live event version. The idea of a robot like this is potentially effective. The way they've executed it might not be up to the standard that it needs to be, but again, they've acknowledged that. They're doing it on limited budget, limited tools, limited time, limited space. So I really like what they're trying to do.
I do as well, actually. I have just sort of been a bit mean to them. I do like this robot. I like that they've done it on a budget. I like that they're just building it in the street. That makes me laugh. It is a very simple to build robot. Like the guy said that, if they can do it, anyone can do it. And I agree with them. I mean, the most complicated thing in there is welding, and that is not nearly as hard as people think it is. So it's a really good robot. This is another one of those robots that I think demonstrates the fact that you can build a good robot on a budget or without having a lot of experience at robot building, and you can get into it and you can build a good robot like that. It does a better job of that than Jellyfish.
Does as good a job of that as Jellyfish. What both teams there have done is they've come along with something distinctive.
Yeah.
And I will always give a little bit of a free pass for that. If you're trying something new out, you get a pass from me.
You rank like this kind of thing so high. It really makes me laugh.
Yeah, and I never thought that I'd be the kind one. I never thought that would... Obviously, I can't describe myself as that today, but I never thought I'd be the person giving people more credit. That's not how I usually am. This is a reflection on you. You're too mean.
Disagree.
Fair enough. I suppose we can move on to High Five then.
High Five with its lifter spinner or something. I don't understand this weapon. Explain it to me, almighty Ryan.
So what they've got, and I had to go onto the wiki to find this out. This was never explained sort of within the show or whatever, because they didn't get far enough. What it actually is interchangeable weaponry. So they have a lifter setup and they have a spinner setup, which is kind of it's sort of a drum, but more a series of connected discs than a drum, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Which I believe is rear mounted. I assume it. I say interchangeable. I don't know if it's just additional, but I don't see how they'd be doing that within the weight limit. But they have both as an option. I would question whether that weapon is really a lifter. I see it, or I imagine it working as more of a clamp, but I suppose it could theoretically work as either.
No idea. It didn't survive long enough to show us.
No, not at all. It's an interesting one again, because what you've got is a sort of new team. So they're a team that I believe have been around on live events a little bit. They got hold of the old robot Smidsy, which, once you know that, you kind of see the very clear evolution from that to this. I'm not sure if it's sharing many parts. I feel like it might be, but it's that very similar look.
An interesting thing about this robot that I quite liked was the rubber-mounted armor. I think that's an interesting idea. I'm sure many other robots do this as well, but it was highlighted as something that these guys did to absorb, ostensibly to absorb some shock. I think rubber-mounted armor is effective if you have armor made of something like Hardox, as opposed to what seems to be very thin aluminium. But let me go and verify.
They've got 4mm Hardox and a lot of polycarbonate. So the rubber mounting really makes sense if you've got a rigid material as armor. When you've got something on there that's A, flexible, and B, weak, I think it becomes less of a sort of... there's less benefit to it. But again, as an idea, I think it's the kind of attention to detail that you really need to be seeing. And it shows that even if they're not necessarily putting together the best robot, they've got good ideas there.
Yeah.
One thing I really love about it, this is just from our control schemes talk a while back, tank-style steering. And also, supposedly, telemetry.
Yeah, I was curious to see how many robots have some kind of feedback to the driver with telemetry, so they know what's going on. That's another thing I'd probably try and get in there. I'd like to get temperature sensors on things like motors and batteries that can feed back to the transmitter.
The one I know of that has that, I don't know if they had it in the last series or they've got it coming for next series, is Storm 2. And I think I've read somewhere about Concussion trying to do the same thing.
There was definitely a robot either in this series or the last one that had some kind of telemetry, and there's also ones in BattleBots that do it as well. There's even like semi-autonomous ones in BattleBots. I think, was it Chomp that has sensors?
Yes, with the LiDAR system. Oh.
Yeah, with sensors on the front to fire their hammer automatically. I really love that. I'd love to see that in over here.
This is not a good melee setup.
No, this is three rubbish... no, I'm going to commit to that. This is three rubbish robots versus Supernova. That's what this is.
Pretty much, yeah. And it doesn't make sense when, on the other side of the heat, you've got 4 experienced teams. I'm going to say experienced. We'll get into why that's not necessarily completely true. But, 4 good robots in the other side.
You said it. No, 3 good robots at most.
All right.
But yeah, it's not mixed up enough. This seems a bit unbalanced. I think they could have taken a few from Melee 2 and put them in Melee 1 to even things up a little bit, because this really is Supernova versus everyone else, and then Supernova kind of dominate, and then you get a rubbish robot that has to go through because of the format of the show.
Which turns out to be quite entertaining, to be fair. Watching Frostbite get eviscerated later on was really good fun, especially for me. Which I suppose, in terms of the show as a spectacle, isn't necessarily a bad thing, but as a legitimate sporting competition, it's again a tiny bit dodgy.
Yeah, not ideal.
Now, I've got to say, in this melee, I thought Worm looked good for the first 3 seconds. It was a lot nippier than I imagined. It just had the slight issue that it completely missed in its attack and didn't really seem to recover from that moment.
Well, it drove into a wall and then stopped, and that was it. They knocked themselves out because they drove into a wall. I don't know if you have more information about this.
Weren't they just beached on the scoop, I seem to recall?
I thought that was it. In a later one, they're beached on the scoop, but in this one, their robot looks perfectly fine, and they just hit into a wall and then just seem to be stopped. Like any other robot, you'd look at it thinking, just reverse, just go back on the stick there, mate, and you'll be fine. But they just didn't, and that was it.
It might have been either, it might have been both. This is one of those times where I don't actually... Well, at least I don't think I know. I'm not saying that I've been right every time previously. I don't want to make that claim.
Yeah, well, they were a bit boring to me. They disappeared into a wall. High 5 got torn to pieces by Supernova, and then...
There's an issue here with the editing.
Is there?
Now, again, disclaimer, I've watched an edited version of the fight, not the broadcast version, but there is a very clear moment right at the beginning of the melee where they show High 5 with damage on it to the rear left, I think it is, which we then see get done by Supernova later on in the fight. That really, really bugs me, because I'd like to believe that I am seeing the fight as it happened, which I realistically know I'm not, because that's not how telly works. But it just takes me out of that moment again, and it makes me wonder what sins they're trying to hide.
That's annoying. I don't mind editing bits out. I don't mind shortening 3 minutes down to something less than that for TV purposes. I do mind them reordering events. That's not cool.
Because what it does, it makes it very hard to work out how quickly High Five actually went out. Because I personally thought that they lasted longer than Worm.
My notes are not thorough enough to confirm if that's what it appeared in the TV show, I'm afraid.
Well, I suppose, actually, that's not a very good way of putting it on my part. I wonder if they actually lasted longer, but that's not the way it looked on TV.
Yeah, that's certainly possible if they've been reordering things.
Which, with Worm getting reinstated later on, would then become a bit of an issue. Because if High Five did last longer, they're the ones that should be coming back in.
I mean, I wonder if it was maybe that High Five was a bit too damaged to be useful, so they had to use Worm, and then they had to try and make it look like that was a more reasonable thing in this edit. I would argue that what they should have done is, if that's the case, I'm not saying it is or isn't, but if that is the case, they just need to be honest about it and be like, we've got to bring in another robot. We would bring in High Five, but they're too damaged, so we've got to go one further down, and we're going to bring in Worm. That's what they,
Precisely. That's how easy that would be. Which, of course, as master editors ourselves now, having done 3 episodes of this, we have every right to say.
Editing kings.
But the overall here is that was an awful fight.
Awful fight. Supernova goes through and they deserve it because they're a great robot, and then Frostbite go through because they were able to spin around, I guess.
Yep, they at least had drive on one side, which was better than everyone else.
Exactly. So they go through by default.
Now, you've said, as you love to say, that there are 3 rubbish robots in this fight, but I would have loved to have seen Worm go through outright. Because I do think that out of those 3, Worm had the best chance of winning a fight.
Yeah, so like the 2 that should have gone through are Supernova and Worm on what it looks like their robot should be capable of. But if your robot is weak enough to break when it drives into a wall, then maybe that's not the case.
It says a lot about the other 2 that we think Worm was the best on the basis of that 20-second showing.
Yep, but there you go. 3 rubbish robots and Supernova.
Now we get to refresh ourselves by talking about some good robots. And you get to start by talking about one you don't think is good. So we've got Crustacean, Ironside 3, Apex, and Pulsar. You're going to not be nice about Crustacean now, aren't you?
So my prediction, yeah, you're right. I don't like Crustacean, and my prediction is that you like it because they innovate with their control scheme. That's what I think. That's why I think you're going to like this robot.
Think away.
This robot, man. I guess it's not that bad. I just don't think it can win. I think it's a bit dull, and the control scheme I'm talking about and alluding to is that they presumably have a conventional control for movement, but then one of the guys has a pair of gloves which is got sensors in it and is connected to the transmitter, so that when he closes his hands, the 2 grippers on the front of Crustacean grip as well, which is completely and utterly pointless.
In a move that will shock and astound you, I don't like it. I think it's a pointless gimmick. I don't see any actual advantage to doing it that way. If anything, what you're creating is a situation where if the driver were for some reason incapacitated, the weapons operator can't take over the controls. That's all you've done with that.
I can't believe you don't like that. That's amazing to me. Yeah, it's pointless. That's innovation that's not even innovation. It's just change for change's sake. I will, just to sort of talk about this kind of like weird and unique control scheme. There was a robot in BattleBots, and hopefully you can remember it, which looked like the top half of a person. It was like a torso with some arms.
Yes, that was by Arthur Chilcott and a couple of the other guys from the old Mortis team.
I can't remember what that robot was called, but it was amazing.
I actually looked at it yesterday and I can't remember the name of it. It was a slightly silly name, but what do you expect from a slightly silly robot, you know?
So this robot was amazing. Like I said, it was the torso of a person with some kind of arms on there. It was all actuated through cables and stuff, so it works in very much the same way that a human arm works, with the tendons pulling on things to grip and to move the arm around. And it was controlled. They had these sensors on their arm. It was a bit like the what are the things called in Pacific Rim? Those big Jaegers, is that the thing?
You're asking the wrong man.
I think they're Jaegers or something like that in Pacific Rim, where you need 2. This massive like robot in the film, and you need 2 people to control it for sci-fi 2 brains reasons. But it controls in a similar way, where I think they had an arm each. with the whole thing. And I really liked that, not because that was a spectacle to see that robot do things and to have it mimic the movement of the person controlling it, and with an arm that complicated with the same very close to human levels of actuation in its arms. There's not many ways of controlling that in a meaningful way. So I can understand why you'd want to do that. In this case, it's just two pincers, and you could have those on a button, and that would be far, far more effective. So having the sort of gloves, motion sensing gloves or whatever, seems completely and utterly pointless. I was completely convinced that you'd like it for innovation reasons, because there's so many other robots that are questionable that you seem to like because they innovate in some way.
The thing is, I like innovation, but I don't like gimmicks. And I see that as more of a gimmick.
Yeah.
So the innovation of coming in with something like jellyfish is that you are doing something that is functionally different. You're not achieving the same function by a different method. You are functioning in a way that other robots don't. Whereas this is basically a system of overcomplicating something unnecessarily. And again, I've acknowledged this a few times, there's probably an element of bias here. Some things I take to, some things I don't. If anything, when it comes to that innovation angle, I think that crustacean is different enough as it is, because it's not a weapon type that we see anywhere else in this series. And it's even quite unique on the live scene. And it's a really good live scene robot because it's mostly up against flippers or axes or hammers. There's no big spinners there. So it's really well suited to that environment. And I'm impressed that they were brave enough to bring it in against all the big spinners. But apart from that, the glove thing is just gimmicky, and that annoys me.
Yep. Not a fan.
I'm trying to think if there's any more. Oh, there's one other thing about it that I'm not a fan of.
Yeah?
And that is the whole plasti-dip paint thing that they claim is for spinner-proofing. That's just not how that works. This is that stuff that people will spray onto an egg or something and drop it and claim that this stuff has stopped the egg breaking. When actually what it's done is just kept all the broken bits of egg in the same place.
Yeah.
It's that stuff. And that's...
Is it the same kind of stuff that Americans truck bed lining stuff?
Precisely, it is that. And the rest of it is 6mm aluminium, which is among the worst metals I can think of for armour against spinners.
Yeah, not ideal.
Unless you Behemoth Scoop. That was a good idea.
It's good as sacrificial armour, but not much else.
And the really telling thing is that they've clearly made this entry with a view to not getting very far, because they haven't upped the weight. They've kept it at the live event 100 kilo, which says very clearly to me that they've come in for this because they could. Fair play to them for applying. Really glad to have the variety there. But their focus is more on doing the live event stuff.
Yeah.
Which I think is a good thing, because I think they add a lot to that, where it is literally 80% very good flippers. Now we get to talk about 3 good spinners. I was waiting for you to disagree there, and you didn't. That's quite a surprise.
Well, I'm thinking about whether or not I disagree. There's definitely at least one good spinner. So Ironside 3 is a good spinner. Apex, I guess we'll get on to this. Should we start with Ironside 3?
No. You go ahead with this, because I'm sat here with my head in my hands trying to work out what on earth you're on about.
Well, I can give you a quick overview of these 3 spinners here.
Please do.
And see what you think. So I like Ironside 3. I think that's a pretty good robot. Apex, I think, is too much. It's almost a full-body spinner. Reminds me a bit of Son of Waiachi, which was an American robot, which is also too much. And then Pulsar has the potential to be an excellent robot, but it is plagued by electronics issues, and that detracts a lot for me. Well, where do you want to start?
We'll go through in order. Ironside 3, first of all. Objectively a very good robot. For some reason, I find it quite forgettable. In my head, before I did my notes on this episode, I was trying to remember who was in the episode. And I got 7 of the 8 robots. Ironside is the one I forgot. Even though they were in the final, they're the one I forgot. And there's just something about it that doesn't stick in my head.
I know what you mean. It's not a standout robot, but it is a good robot, I think. I do like it. My one issue with it is it's the same issue as I mentioned with Supernova, of the plane of the spinner is not parallel with the floor, which I feel like must have some problems with gyroscopic precession, especially when they start spinning on the spot. I think that was the cause of a couple of issues they had where their spinning bar was hitting their own robot a little bit, because I presumably when they were spinning on the spot, the gyroscopic precession of their bar was pushing one end of it in a way that it shouldn't have been pushed.
The angle of it is something that I actually quite like, and it's also a design decision that I don't really see an alternative to, unless they made the whole thing a lot wider and a lot flatter.
Yeah, I think to get a horizontal bar like that, you've got to have a design like Carbide or Tombstone or PP3D, where it's either in the robot and therefore a wider robot, or it's below the robot. To have it on top, you've got a situation where you're potentially spinning a long way above all the other robots. So to get like a bar of this kind of length with this kind of reach, you are very limited in what you can do. It's a compromise that they have to make, but it's there.
And it is good that it has a bit of difference to the other very successful bar spinners that we see. It does do things slightly differently, which, as I think we've very well established by now, is a thing that I usually give a bit of weight to.
Yeah, I do like it. I do like that it's got the longer reach, and which sounds funny given that I think Apex is too much. But yeah, it's a good robot. I do like it.
One thing I've really got to question is their claim that both bars are around the 35 kilo mark. Because you look at their bar and you look at the Apex bar, which they say is 37 kilos, and that's including the pulley assemblies and things like that. It's a lot smaller. I really do not think that is 35 kilos of rotating mass on that robot.
But I'd sort of trust that they'd have to be reasonably accurate with that.
Bear in mind, Carbide is what, 22, 24 kilos, I think it is? Which admittedly is a shorter and sort of thinner, I suppose is the only word for it, bar. It just seems a bit, I don't know.
Maybe Ironside have lined theirs with tungsten.
It's the only possible explanation.
But I mean, it could just be like a more dense material. It is bigger. I imagine there's quite a lot more material in there than Carbide has. So
yeah, maybe I'm just talking out of my back bottom.
I have no problem believing that weighs 35 kilograms.
What I do really like is the difference between the two bars. They've got one that's kind of a hammery head, and then the slightly hooked ones as well.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know what actual advantage that gives, if having that slightly sort of sharper impact point actually does anything, but it does look cool.
It's one of those things that you look at and think that should make a difference, but my suspicion is that with the energy levels they have and all that kind of stuff, it's probably not a meaningful difference.
There is a bit of precedent for this with Hypnodisc. So in their first series, which I think was Series 3, their disc had some sort of sharpened points on the outside. And for Series 4, they changed that very intentionally to be broader, so that instead of cutting, it was kind of tearing. So the difference they saw was that instead of making holes in robots, they were ripping whole panels off of them.
Yeah.
And I do wonder if the same logic kind of applies here, this idea of quite a lot of the metals that we're coming up against, we're not necessarily going to pierce, so we want to try and just dent them and maybe sort of pull them away, or just try and transfer a bit more vibration through the opponent.
Yeah.
There must be some kind of logic to the sort of blunt bars that we see from most of the bar spinners.
Yeah, I don't know. Very possibly, but I don't know.
And that's the style that Apex have gone for as well, that big clubby style with that little bit of extra mass on the ends. I can understand your criticism of Apex. It does just look out of proportion. But at the same time, I think it looks really cool.
It's not about the aesthetics of it, actually. I think I have the same problem with this as I have with full body spinners, which is you end up with a lot less, I don't know, I just felt like you end up with a lot less control over your robot. I think having this kind of thing where no matter where someone comes at you from, they're going to hit your weapon is interesting. But I guess it just doesn't suit the kind of style of robot that I like. I think I quite like robots that are capable of doing some level of precision, are capable of attacking when they want to and on their terms. This thing, it's sort of not got that. I can't imagine there's enough mass left in their body of their robot to where they're not going to be just throwing themselves across the arena when that bar hits.
That, I think, is a more valid criticism. I think if you're looking for a precision hit out of a spinner, you're onto a loser. Maybe the drums have a slightly better chance of that. They're a little more sort of surgical. If you look at Minotaur taking all 6 wheels off of Bronco in BattleBots, for example, that's the more precision side of it. But a big bar is not like a scalpel. It is a sledgehammer.
So my thing here is not necessarily like precision of where you're hitting. I guess it's control about when you hit and when you're deciding to do damage. I think if you're in a situation where, you know, with even something like Carbide with a big spinner, or Tombstone with these big things that are not, like I said, they're not scalpels, but Carbide feels like it's got much more intent about when it attacks someone and when it doesn't. Whereas I think this one could probably inadvertently hit a lot of stuff. I think you've also got a disadvantage where if you're, you know, near the side of the arena, you're going to catch on things. If you're near the spikes and they come up, you're much more likely to catch on things. It's a robot that I think seems like it's got less control over when it's delivering damage, when that weapon is contacting with things and stuff like that.
I think with Apex, they would view the idea of we can hit things that are behind us as a plus. It's almost a slightly defensive weapon design in that respect. It's that idea of good luck attacking us without getting hit yourself. I completely agree that obviously the big issue they're going to have is that when they hit something or something hits them, they've not got a great deal of control over where they end up. But that's true of a lot of the spinners. That's true of any horizontal to a degree.
Yeah, I think it's really much more pronounced in this robot.
It's very much a robot that goes, we're just going to store and deliver as much energy as possible. Let's see how that goes. Which as a spectacle is really good. In a competition with this format, it doesn't seem like a particularly viable long-term strategy. You know, you're going to be breaking yourself as much as you're breaking anyone else. The other thing of note about Apex is that they were actually a reserve. There was, I think it's a Dutch robot called Pacifier, which is a vertical crusher which withdrew, and that is why they were there in the first place. So where we've said about A, this is a very spinner-heavy heat, and B, this side of the melee being particularly strong, and not that varied, that does go a little way to explaining that, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, even if that other robot was meant to be in this melee and then this guy just replaced it, I feel like it would not have been too much to ask for the BBC to reorder and rearrange these melees a little bit.
Maybe. The final robot in this melee is Pulsar, and I am not going to sit here and listen to any criticism of Pulsar, because it is by far my favourite robot across the two new series.
Well, in that case, we may as well end the recording now.
What is not to love about Pulsar?
So it's a robot that I want to like, actually. I think it's a very interesting robot. I like the weapon. I like the fact that it's using much more modern technology. They describe it a lot as a very high-tech robot, in that it is all brushless. It is all very clever. It's exactly the kind of thing I would do coming into this, is let me go and find the latest technology available to me and use that. I like it's got a lot of power behind it. I mean, they say it's got the fastest drum in the competition. There's a lot to like about it. But all of that said, its constant problems with burning its motors out is immensely frustrating to see, and it's especially frustrating in this series, given that they had exactly the same problems last year. The guy comes in and says it's a brand new robot, like completely rebuilt, and it seems like he's not learnt his lesson about power delivery and not burning these things out. And maybe what you said earlier about that maybe being an intentional design, because we only need it to last 3 minutes and that's fine. And they bought a whole load of spares this time. Obviously, you know, they're designing it and preparing for these fights with that in mind. And I think that is a terrible, terrible strategy. Like, his robot cannot last 3 minutes of fighting. It just can't. As soon as it's in a situation where it's pushing other robots around, those motors are having to do a lot more work, and they're drawing a lot more current, and then they're burning themselves out, which is so frustrating to see, especially given how much potential this has. Which is my big problem with it, and that is the big criticism, I'm almost inclined to say it's not a well-designed robot, because it feels like at this point that it is designed to work this way, and that seems crazy to me. But if you don't want to go that far, at the very least it's a badly executed robot. It shouldn't burn out that much. It should be able to do a 3-minute bout. It just should, and it can't. And yeah, like I said a second ago, it's especially frustrating given that they had exactly this problem last year.
There are things in there that, even if I don't agree with them, I can't disagree with them. And I think that quite a lot of what you're saying is reasonable. I agree that Pulsar maybe oversteps that line in terms of we're pushing the envelope. I think there's a point where you push the envelope so far it falls off the table, which is not the correct use of that analogy, but I'm rolling with it. How can I put this?
I'm just to jump in quickly. I think it's pushing the envelope in the wrong way. I think it should be using the modern high-tech equipment. Someone's got to do it, and I think, you know, the early to mid-20s engineer is the perfect sort of like person to be doing that in many ways. It's sort of like that must be a great narrative for the BBC and all that kind of stuff. They get to do like brains versus brawn, but it feels like he's pushing newer technology in a way like well beyond what it seems to be designed to do. Like, come in and use an all brushless design. Do a really fast drum spinner. Go as fast as you can, but design it to be more reliable. I don't know if he's overdriving his motors or not. I don't know enough about this robot, but it is, you know, to so consistently lose a drive. And when you hear him talking in the control booth, as a matter of fact, lost left drive, as if he's expecting it, is infuriating to me. And which is why I think he's pushing it the envelope in the wrong direction almost. He's taken this modern technology, and then that's almost not enough, and he's pushing that beyond its limits, which I don't think he needs to do. I think he could have a competition winning robot if he used exactly that technology, but just stepped back a little bit, just brought it back enough to where he's not almost guaranteed to burn out a motor in every single fight.
I think there's something that's been expressed by a few different teams, which is you don't get accepted for the next series by saying you've made it less powerful.
He didn't need to make it less powerful, though. Like, I think he could have... My assumption is that he's made it more powerful since last year, and I think he could have kept it the same, Like, just kept it the same, but made it much more reliable.
Yeah, but I suppose what I'm saying there and not saying very well is that I think there is a pressure, if you want to be accepted for the next series, to make improvements, and reliability isn't an impressive sounding improvement. I think what you've got here, and bear in mind that last series it lost out for completely different reasons. It was having issues with radio reception last time, and that was the reason that it struggled.
But it consistently burnt out motors then as well. Like, he lost drive motors doing that as well. Like, he burnt out speed controllers last year. Like, I know that the bigger one was his reception issues, but, like, he faced exactly this issue as well and doesn't seem to have done anything to change it. If anything, he's made it worse.
Actually, I suppose in a way it might be that the reception issues came in early enough in fights that he didn't get time to burn out motors as much as he would have. So maybe I'm not seeing that issue as much as I should. Again, this comes down to philosophy as much as anything, and sort of personal taste, I suppose. I love seeing someone go out and try to push the technology. Brushless in itself isn't a completely problematic technology. You've got Big Nipper, who were in last series and they're around on the live event. They've had brushless drive for quite a while, so you know that it can work. But I think there are some engineers out there who want to push, and they feel that need to push. And they're the people who make it possible for other people to do it well in future. They go out and they make the mistakes so that no one else has to. And what you've got in Pulsar is something that, when it works, boy, does it work. And for me, as a TV fan, that's also worth having as well, because Pulsar has delivered some exceptional hits. And as much as it has then ended up in a sort of, I was going to say a puddle of smoke, that's not how smoke works, but the fact that it's then broken afterwards is almost worth that.
I completely disagree with that. It is both as a competition and as a piece of TV. I think you want these big hitting robots, these sort of almost the stars of Robot Wars, should be able to not have these stupid defeats. Like, Pulsar should not be losing battles because it burns out its own drive system. It shouldn't happen. And like, if Carbide did that, I would be stunned. And they obviously they never, as far as I'm aware, never have, at least not on television. And I guess related to that, you've got these big stars of Robot Wars. I think Pulsar could very easily be one of them, and once it is at that point, surely it doesn't need to do these ridiculous upgrades to get re-accepted by the BBC. I think once you've got to a point where you are almost a regular on the show, just doing reliability upgrades should be enough.
You're right that it should be. I'm not sure that it is. And I think it's not necessarily about the truth of that situation, it's about the team's perception of that situation, where they're seeing that there is a new series being made, they want to invest time and money into making something for it, so they're going to do everything they can to be accepted.
Yeah.
And that, again, is a fault on the production side as much as anything. That shouldn't be a thing they have to think about, but it's kind of the reality that we're set into now. I think it's probably time that we left Pulsar alone a bit and got into this actual melee. Although what there is left to say, I'm not really sure.
I guess we can just sort of do a quick summary. So Pulsar gets a great hit on Crustacean and pretty much kills it.
Was it not Ironside that hit Crustacean on the side?
Got them written here, I've got Crustacean and Pulsar. I think you're right there, that Ironside did get a big hit on them as well.
Again, I watch edits, what do I know? Pulsar did, however, get a beautiful uppercut on Apex.
Yep, that's another nice big hit, and that's sort of about it, really. That sort of takes out both Crustacean and Apex. They take one hit each from a spinner almost, and then from one of the other spinners, I should say, and then they're done.
I'm glad that Crustacean went out first hit rather than having to take a few, because I like that robot, and I don't want it to need a complete rebuild. So in a way, I'm quite happy with that. There is a touch of controversy on this one, which is that legend has it, the Apex team were under the impression that the 3-2-1 activate they were hearing was a dry run, when it actually turned out to be the real thing. So supposedly, they've sat there going, that's weird, everyone else is fighting us, and have therefore been a bit delayed in getting spun up. Not sure how much of a difference that makes, but it's a thing that's worth having in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say about it. It's just constant, just feels like there's just, in every episode, there's some controversy that stems from the organisation and management of this tournament. And I don't know what more we can say about it other than it's bull that it happened.
So while we're talking about controversies, I kind of want to jump us ahead to the Pulsar Ironside fight, which was controversial enough last time they fought. And it's kind of gone, there's kind of a double controversy here, isn't there? First of all, we still don't know what counts as being immobile, and then we've got some madness with the judge's decision. How on earth do we even start on this?
I guess, shall we go and analyse the definition of mobile?
Do it.
Because in the episode where we talked about Cherub, we talked about there was one fight where they didn't seem to move. They were just trying to do it looked like they were just trying to do a handstand. And then you revealed to me afterwards that their motors weren't working or something when they went in, which was interesting that they didn't seem to be mobile when they started, and that was an interesting decision. And I at the time I joked saying maybe it's enough that their motor or their weapon motor is technically capable of dragging them along. And then we see in this one that seems to genuinely be enough. So Pulsar loses its drive completely on its left, which means that if its drum isn't spinning and it tries to go forwards or backwards, it's just spinning around that point and it can't move anywhere, and it's not in any level of control. Now, when its drum is spinning at full speed, there's enough gyroscopic effects to lift the robot up, and then it is technically able to get outside of its radius. Not in any meaningfully under control way, it's just technically able, by spamming forwards and backwards, to move around the arena randomly. And that seems to have been enough for that to count as mobile, which I think is rubbish. I guess by the written rule, in terms of if it is, the robot has to be able to get outside of its own radius, then I guess it's technically valid. I would argue that rule needs to be updated to include something about whether or not it's moving with intent and whether or not it's, got control over where it's going and stuff like that.
For me, I think that is exceptional enough driving from Ellis that I'm happy to give it a pass. It's something that we saw in BattleBots as well with Minotaur, where they took some damage and it meant they had to gyro dance to get anywhere. So the way I see it, that is a form of controlled movement.
But he's not in control. He's got no control over where he ends up there. I don't think you could tell him, go from where you are now. Let's pick an arbitrary point on the arena floor. Go and get there. And even less doing that while avoiding obstacles. If he was on one side of the pit and you told him to get to the other side, I do not think he could do that with all the time in the world. I don't think he's under any control. I don't think he's got any control over that robot anymore.
I can't say with certainty that he could, but I also can't say with certainty that he couldn't. So for the sake of this discussion, I'm going to give that the benefit of the doubt. And the reason I'll do that is that I think with the rules, you've always got to pick an arbitrary point that you say is okay, everything one side is fine, everything one side is not fine. And I think they could be a bit more specific. I think you should be able to move towards your opponent. To me, that is the test. Can you go towards your opponent? Because that is then a very easy thing to say, well, are they doing that or aren't they? The other issue is that we've had to ask this question a lot now. There are lots of times where a robot has lost drive on one side and it either has been counted out or hasn't, or has been after a long time. I'm not sure they know what the rule means at this point because it's not being applied consistently.
To their credit, I think it's a hard thing to measure in many ways. It's like, how do you check that? How long does a robot have to be spinning around before you start that time? I mean, you could, if you wanted to be really picky about it, you could have someone, each of them studying one robot and starting a timer the second they stop for any reason. And then if they stay there for 10 seconds, then they're counted as immobile. And maybe that's the actual solution. I don't know, but that seems almost a bit far.
That is kind of what we have now, in that Noel Sharkey is there as head judge, making the decision when to start it.
Yeah.
And the variance comes in when does he make that decision. There's a great shot, it's either in the next heat or the final, where there's this kind of crash zoom on him as he presses the button, which is fantastic. But completely irrelevant here. I just really wanted to relive that in my mind for a second. Yeah, he is there. He is doing that. That is part of his responsibilities. And that kind of brings us into the other side here, where that count was started and then stopped again.
Yeah.
It's just such a mess to have to try and talk about. And it would be made so much easier if we had something like RefBot again. Because at least then there's a visual indication for everyone. Audience, competitor, judge, whoever. I didn't like RefBot. I don't want RefBot. But I want something serving that purpose.
Yeah, I guess RefBot has the advantage of, when that thing stops counting, it's quite obvious to everyone involved. Because I feel like the other team, like Ellis, was asking, why aren't they attacking me, almost? It's sort of like, why have they backed off? He was a bit confused about that. And presumably the Ironside team were a bit confused about why Cease hadn't been called. Why was it that they were all still moving around?
Because we had this with Beast versus Gabriel last series as well. It's exactly the same situation again. And the fact that they've had that problem and not managed to address it, and it's come up again, doesn't reflect well on the way that this is being thought through. There's another competition starting up soon. They're sort of taking entries now in China called King of Bots. And I was reading through their rules. It's not easy because they have been translated from Chinese and that's not always a perfect process. But they treat this very slightly differently in that they say you have to be able to move outside of I think it's 10-metre radius, which seems a bit large. Maybe it wasn't that much, but they actually set a distance of radius to be moving out of.
I think that's quite a good idea because that that provides the same function as showing intent to move in a specific way. I'm moving in a controlled fashion somewhere else.
And of course, the other potential answer to this is get rid of the round robin system and tell competitors if your opponent is immobile, go nuts.
Yeah, that would also solve many of these problems.
It's a shame to be sat here talking about the rules for as long as we have been, but it is getting in the way a little bit. And of course, 90% of viewers probably don't even care, but we are the 10%.
Well, even 10% is a bit generous there. The outcome of this is that it goes to a judge's decision, and then we have probably quite a controversial decision from it as well, which is that Noel Sharkey goes and speaks to the teams and says that they're going to give them 2 points each because obviously Ironside stopped because they thought the timer had counted Pulsar out. But they hadn't, so it hadn't technically happened, and there was mass confusion. So the solution from the judges is to give them 2 points each.
It gets worse. My understanding is that when the filming was being done, the 3 minutes expired, they did a normal judge's decision, which went to Pulsar. Not entirely sure why. Personally think Ironside were the worthy winners of that fight. And there was then an appeal from the Ironside team, quite rightly as well, which then resulted in that compromise.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
And again, why that wasn't shown, not quite sure. I'd rather that was just transparent and there, but whatever.
That's probably the BBC trying to save face.
Well, yeah, clearly. But it's, again, part of me when I was watching that live went, I don't understand why Ironside are taking that compromise. I think they deserve the points from that, as much of a Pulsar fanboy as I am. But they were in a situation where they were going to get nothing out of that fight, which would definitely have been unfair. So under those circumstances, I think 2 each isn't a bad compromise.
So I guess without that knowledge of the appeal and stuff, 2 each seems wrong to me because that is, at least my feeling, maybe I'm completely wrong, but my feeling has always been there's a maximum number of points that will be distributed among all the teams. And then sort of by suddenly going, here's 2 each, breaks that a little bit.
Yeah, it technically messes with the structure of the competition. So in that respect, I think 1 each would have made slightly more sense. I'm not sure that 2 each is fair on the other competitors, but it's a situation where they've had to pull this out of their backsides to get an outcome out of it.
Yeah. So normally when it goes to a judge's decision, there are 2 points available to the winner of that decision. Now in this case, the decision is effectively a draw, and I think those 2 points should then be split to give them 1 each, as opposed to suddenly magicking up 2 extra points to give to the other team. That's my problem with that. But I think it's a little bit different given that it's the result of an appeal.
This also raises the question, should the judges be able to call a match a draw? Would that be helpful to the competition if that were an option?
No, I'm trying to think of any other competition that has draws in it that are useful. I mean, even in,
Well, many sports, but
well, I guess many sports. I'm just thinking like the big ones that immediately spring to mind are like football and stuff like that, where they've got in football they've got the penalties at the end and all that kind of stuff. Like there's you have to have a winner.
But this is a league system. In most sports where you've got a league system, you allow a draw as an outcome. And I can understand not wanting to allow it as 3 minutes is up, both teams get the points, because that would lead to teams being too defensive, I think. If they could go out and play for a draw, that wouldn't be right.
Yeah.
But if you get a fight that's too close to call, I see no reason not to say, yeah, we can't separate you. Well done, you both get points out of this. I think it's a very American thing to demand an outcome.
Yeah, I think I'm probably fine with a draw. I'd have to see it, I guess, to see how I feel about it. But I have no immediate objection to it. I just have an objection, I guess, to it sort of being a very ad hoc thing in this instance. It's a really tough thing to do, though. There's no obviously right answer, really. It's a tricky thing to have to deal with.
We don't know what the right answer is, but we know that the current answer is probably a bit wrong.
It is unsatisfactory.
So having kind of skipped ahead in the head-to-heads, I don't really want to go back through. There's a lot of short fights. They're not all really worth talking about. The one I do want to get to, though, is Supernova versus Frostbite, mainly because I loved it. I have no problem with seeing certain robots get eviscerated, and this is one that I was definitely happy to see go.
I'm not surprised.
It's almost like I'm biased or something. There were some good words from the Supernova team before this. Never underestimate your opponent.
Yep, wise words.
They certainly showed them, and this is going to sound very FA Cup third round, they showed them some respect in the way that they took that fight on. They definitely didn't underestimate them.
No. My thoughts on this is that Supernova, again, showed very good control of their robot. They were fairly tactical. They took time to line up their shots and make sure they were going to get good contact, and
they found that one weak spot,
and the tiny little Achilles heel that Frostbite have there. And yeah, they ripped the side and a wheel and indeed a motor out of Frostbite there. Did very well, and they broke their own chain in the process, though, unfortunately.
Yeah, they really ate that chain inside, didn't they?
Yeah.
You see, I don't know where I'm getting this from, but I feel like that was potentially a tension issue on the chain. Because it's gone, you know, if it was an issue with a lack of clutch or whatever, I'd expect that chain to go on an impact. And I'd expect it to go on an impact with something more solid than Frostbite. What I'm imagining happening is that chain not being up to tension, so as it's spinning, it develops a kink in it. And when that gets pulled tight by going around one of the sprockets, that's a point for it to break. I don't know where I've got that from. I don't know if it's something one of the teams said, but that's what I have in my head as having happened there.
That's certainly possible. I think even if it was completely tensioned correctly and had no clutch, I think even that is enough to break it. I wouldn't necessarily expect it to break on the first thing. I think, metals, they fatigue over time. If you do several hits, every single time those chain links get a massive tug on and the metal will fatigue. So I can understand, or it makes sense to me, that there might be 3 good hits in it before the chain break, assuming they've got no clutch.
But they're going through Frostbite like it's not even there. I really don't see there being that much force on that chain.
So on their first hit, they caught the motor and then tore the inside of the motor. What's the fancy name for that? I almost had it. I think I'm pretty sure it's the armature. They pulled that out of the motor, which is no mean feat. So I think they are getting pretty solid hits. I do think there is a lot of impact between, and you can see as well that Supernova, they were themselves being thrown away from that. I think there was a lot of energy exchange there.
True. The main thing I'm looking at is that final hit they get, where the chain is already broken off, so they're hitting just with the inertia that is left in the disc.
Yeah,
and they come away still spun up. That impact hasn't even stopped a disc that's got no drive. I suppose that's the thing that's making me question how much stress is really being put on the system by an impact with Frostbite.
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say. Need to speak to the designers.
But boy, did they go to town. They killed it 3 times over.
So they took that third hit they took was, I would say, unnecessary. I think they had firmly established that they'd won with their first hit. They took one more, which you could see that the Frostbite team were a bit unhappy about, or at least one of them was like, oh no, not again, kind of thing. The second hit was the definitive, I have definitely, unequivocally won this battle now, and I've also broken my own chain, and that seems like the sensible place to stop. But they came in for one last hit, which I think is a bit mean, personally. It's always hard to balance these things, because sometimes I do want them to go in. Sometimes I do enjoy the spectacle of seeing a robot completely and utterly destroyed. And I think I'm, generally speaking, much more comfortable with that in finals. In this situation, Frostbite would have had more fights to do. It had Supernova gone quite as far down. I think in this case, I think it was Supernova's first hit that did the damage that they couldn't repair anyway. So I don't think it would have...
Yeah, that was my thinking. As soon as they'd lost a motor with no spares, they were done.
Yeah, it wouldn't have made a difference if they'd stopped. So it's, a bit moot at this point. But, that third hit seems a bit unnecessary.
I think every time you go into that arena with a working robot, you should be prepared in your mind for it to come out very not working. And the format does complicate that, but that is still a very basic thing. If you go into a fight with a fighting robot, you accept the possibility that it is going to get absolutely wrecked. And it isn't like Supernova were doing that tactically to get rid of the Frostbite threat. So in that respect, I didn't see a problem with it. If it had been 2 robots that were potentially competing for the heat, I'd probably have more to say about it. But the way I see it, the moment Frostbite took those hits, they were out of the competition anyway. But that doesn't necessarily make it morally okay. That just makes it practically okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of interesting about sportsmanship and stuff. I think if you've got 2 teams that get on with each other and are both completely fine with it, then that's fine, completely destroy a robot, but I think it's a bit unfair to say that everyone should go in with the expectation that their robot will get completely destroyed. I think for some people it's fine. They can be detached from their robot. I think for some people, if they've spent like years working on this design, or if it's their first one, people get attached to these things, and to see it completely and utterly destroyed can be heartbreaking. And I also think that, especially when you've already lost, that's the other thing, is Supernova had won at that point. Like I said, after the first hit, they'd won. So every attack after that isn't changing anything. Like you say, that's not as if they're doing that to make sure that threat isn't going to be a problem anymore. They're not doing it to make sure they've won. It's just gratuitous violence almost. And I think it's a bit unfair, personally. Or maybe I'm slightly more of a gentleman in this case. Who knows? It may be that if I were in the arena, I would just go to town on everyone. I don't know. It's a hard one to do.
I'm just sitting here thinking that we've put time aside in our week to sit here and talk about a TV programme which is predicated on the idea of robots smashing each other up. And you're complaining about gratuitous violence. It's all gratuitous. That's the point. The whole thing is violence. None of it has an actual real-world use. But again, I have to acknowledge my own hypocrisy, because earlier I said that I was glad that Crustacean didn't take more damage because I didn't want to have to rebuild it. So I know I'm a hypocrite here.
I think there's something to be said for being a bit of I say gentleman, I think that's a bit sexist, but you know what I mean? Like being a good sport about it and being, I've won the fight and that's enough. I think you don't necessarily need to go all out in completely destroying.
Historically, the culture of Robot Wars is that when you lost, you got destroyed. Whether your opponent did it or the House Robots did it, that was what happened.
I mean, if that was much more consistent, I guess that would be what it is. But I think because of the round robin format, and because not everyone does that, it's a bit harder to judge.
And the format really is why we're having this conversation.
Yeah, that at least 2 hours is a bit limiting in this way.
But because it's Frostbite, I'm fine. No, that's not true. I will say for the team, they took it really well.
Yeah.
And I don't think we've had any teams in this reboot, with the slight exception of Apollo, but I don't think they really mean it, complaining about those hits.
Shall we take a moment to go and have a conversation with Dr. Lucy Rogers?
Yes, we shall. I think this is the best judges segment of the whole series, because it's the only one that's actually about fighting robots.
I think the idea is very sound. I have questions about the execution of this idea.
Oh, that's fair. That's absolutely fair. It wasn't a good section.
So the premise here is that Angela has gone to speak with Lucy about where you start with building a robot, and they're doing a demonstration of the various armour types. They demonstrate a form of plastic. What is it?
It'd be HDPE.
Yeah, so they go and demonstrate HDPE, they demonstrate wood, they demonstrate aluminium, some kind of hardened steel, and then proper hardox. And they just give some demonstrations about the pros and cons of each type of armor, which is an interesting premise. But my question here is, they talk about how HDPE is a good defense against hammers, which I mostly agree with, but a bad defense against spinners. And then the example weapon they use to describe a spinner is an angle grinder, which I have big problems with, because an angle grinder is not a spinner. When you talk about a robot with a spinning weapon, you're thinking of the carbides, the hypnodiscs, the aftershocks, the things with these bars or these big discs where the damage is done by an impact. And that is much more in line with the impact of a hammer than it is with the impact of an angle grinder. Like an angle grinder, it grinds away.
It's abrasion, isn't it?
Yes, it's an abrasive weapon as opposed to this impact weapon. Now, a spinning weapon is like a hammer, but turned up to 11. There's a lot more energy in there than a hammer would have. But I think it's a bad example, or a bad thing to do in terms of demonstrating these different armor types.
I think it's one verbal slip in an otherwise good segment that does detract from it a lot.
So I think if they didn't describe it as a spinner, I think it would be a lot better. To me, it still has the problem that basically no one uses abrasive weapons like this.
It's literally dead metal and that's it.
Yeah, dead metal is the only one that has anything even close to this. So it's still a bad example in terms of the relevance to the competition, but it's also probably basically the only thing they could demonstrate in a safe way with two presenters. So that's fair enough. I can completely understand they don't want to be, unless they do a lot of preparation with that small test arena of lining experiments up and then showing what happens when a big spinning weapon, as we normally think of it, hits these different armor things. I think in terms of, two people just doing a quick demonstration of armor types, they did a very good job. But I think, yeah, calling it a spinner detracts from it, and in an ideal world, they'd have put the time in to do a more relevant weapon. But it is what it is.
I really hope they do more of that style of tech segment.
Yeah.
I think there is room, if they're going to have these segments anyway, there is room for every single one of them to be about a different element of building a robot. There is room, potentially, over a series, to go through the basics of an ant weight build.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
2 minutes per episode looking at this is the speed controller, this is what it does. These are the motors, these are the considerations when you use them. These are some materials you might want to make armour out of. That would be perfect.
It would be a really good thing to have.
But instead, we're talking about Amazon drones and bees, which is interesting, but just very slightly off of what it could be. And again, this is my teacher hat on again, and I can't take it off, unfortunately.
I mean, the Amazon drones and the bees is very in line with the BBC. That's exactly the kind of thing I think they often try to get in these kinds of shows. But I agree with you completely. The how do you actually go about building a robot is much more relevant. It's much more interesting. I think it would serve the idea of getting more people involved in engineering much better, as opposed to sort of the usual thing of look at these really cool like robots in space. As a kind of encouragement thing is one thing, but I think actually showing practical advice for here's how you can build an actual robot that you can use and potentially even get on television is I would say much more encouraging.
This does represent something that we see in STEM education in general, where there's kind of two branches. There's the awe and wonder side, which is basically show people things that are cool and interesting, that sort of raise the value of science, technology, engineering and maths in their own minds. The sort of thing that plants the seed for a potential future career in that thing.
Yeah.
And that is a good thing. I won't detract from that. I think Robot Wars does that anyway. So I'd like to see them go for that deeper level of engagement of, okay, here are some skills that you can learn that are going to be useful if you want to do more of this. Here is a way of developing those skills and having fun. That's what I'd really like to see. But I don't think that'll happen because the awe and wonder, just plain and simply, is easier. Talking as we kind of were of awe and wonder, we have got one of the hits of the series in this episode. I personally rate this above Cherub getting launched into the wall. And that is the Pulsar uppercut on Supernova.
That is a spectacular hit.
That is the perfect demonstration of spinning weapons on different planes.
Something I really loved about this hit is that once they both land, both robots are just stationary for a moment. And there's a question of have they both been destroyed? But then they both start moving again. And it's almost as if they've both just landed there in shock about what just happened and not really sure what to do with themselves. And then, this is what I'm meant to be doing. And then they both start moving again. It's quite funny.
It's just, this is what slow-mo was made for. There's that beautiful shot that's kind of focused more on Pulsar than Supernova, where the hit comes in. And obviously Pulsar's not gone flying too far because it's uppercutting. And there's just the sparks all around it landing on the floor and sort of persisting there for a fraction of a second. That is properly badass. And that, Pulsar is the perfect robot to be in the middle of that shot because it does look so good.
Yes, it is. It's a glorious moment in television, unequivocally.
And then we get an even better moment, arguably, when we see the first outing of the wave.
That wave really cracked me up. That's really towing the line of just being a bit of an arse, But it's funny because normally robots spin to win. When they think they've won, they just spin on the spot and a bit of showmanship and stuff. And the wave is less showy than that, but also more showy than that in a lot of ways. It's funny. It's almost like in Worms 2, you can prod worms and it does no damage to them, but you can poke them off the edge. It's almost like that. It's like that's not really doing any damage. It's just insult to injury almost. It's quite funny. Really, really towing the line.
Pulsar does that instead of spinning around. If it did, it'd burn out another speed controller.
I'm surprised he didn't break that Shriemek motor doing it, to be honest.
In fairness, I think for the final, they started using the speed controller from the Shriemek on the drive or something, didn't they?
Oh, yeah. They broke all that motoring system in a different way later on. There wasn't a single motor or speed controller that didn't get broken in by them at some point. They're looking at, that bloody Shriemek motor, that still works. We can't be having that. No, let's go put that where the drive motor was, just to really make sure it gets destroyed.
It's a shame. These are the only fights even vaguely worth talking about. The final itself was a no contest.
Yeah, it was just, Pulsar at that point was in pieces, really. They, like we just mentioned, they've got a Shriemek motor being used as a drive system. They just all kinds of madness to make that thing work. Their drum doesn't spin up at all. They've got no weapon.
Let's just time warp back to Heat A when we were told that Sabretooth wouldn't be able to compete without a working weapon.
Yeah.
Let's just remind ourselves that that was a thing again.
It's just so frustrating. And yes, it was just, it was Ironside were obviously going to win that. And they made damn sure they won that as well. There was nothing left to chance there. They were taking no chances with the judges. They beat on Pulsar. Again, way more than they probably needed to, but in this case, I would say justified, given that, the last 2 fights they've had with them have been wrapped in controversy. To sort of finally have a definitive, we have won this fight, is probably very therapeutic for them, if nothing else.
And Pulsar is a robot that can take a good beating. All of this brings us on to your favourite part of the show. It's time to give some ratings. Now, earlier today, I sent you a PDF file.
Okay, let me go and...
7 pages long.
Let me go and find it.
Because I thought you might need a bit of a visual prompt for this one.
You know me so well.
Today, I would like you to rate this episode by comparing it to a Robot Wars entrant with facial hair. Now, I've given you 7 options. If you can think of another one, that's fine too. But I'll be honest, it was actually quite hard to find them. As you will tell by number 7, I was struggling.
I'm going to stick to this one. Let me go down this list then. So on the first on the list, you have Roger Plant, who, so presumably then these are the robots that they've done as well. So the Mule, Big Cheese, and Wheelie Big Cheese. So the robots that this guy's done or been involved with.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got John Reed, who's been responsible for Kilohertz, Terahertz, and Beta. I'm almost tempted to pronounce that Beta just because the Americans went to such effort to call it Beta.
You want to undo their good work.
just for fun. And then Rex Garrett, who looks an awful lot like the first guy, Roger Plant, but we'll just over that, who did...
Illuminati confirmed.
Yeah, so Recyclops and Cassius, and then Noel...
And Cassius too, technically, but it was awful.
And then you've put Noel Sharkey here. Is he an entrant? Has he entered into Robot Wars, has he?
Honourable mention.
Just an honourable mention. He's got his, Matrix glasses on in that picture. Dave Moulds, the man responsible for... or one of the men responsible for Carbide.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the bottom... No, not the bottom. You've got Arthur Chilcott, who did Mortis. That is an impressive beard. I like that beard.
It is one hell of a beard.
And then, and then Will Thomas, who's done Shockwave and Aftershock, who is just barely got facial hair. What is that picture, man?
Is this going in the show notes, Spidey
Yes.
I was worried that when I found this picture, you wouldn't believe that he has facial hair. So I did a little zoom and enhance just to make sure that was clear.
We've got a picture of him with his dad slightly cropped out, and then a zoom and enhance on his face, and then a zoom and enhance on his face, complete with contrast. That's quite... I'm just going to scroll up now. I've seen that. So I think this is an episode wrapped in controversy and that kind of thing. But ultimately, I think because of the massive hit and the impressiveness of that fight between Supernova and Pulsar, I'm going to have to go with Arthur Chilcott because he's got, I think, the most impressive beard of all of the images you've seen here. I think they're the things that match up to me. An impressive beard for an impressive moment.
See, I'm going very much the other way. I'm going with Dave Moulds just because it's really short, like most of these fights were.
But not short enough for the... not short enough to be a Will Thomas, then.
Yeah, there's no zoom and enhance going on here. It's very clearly facial hair.
Fair enough. Well, a Dave Moulds / Arthur Chilcott episode. So, shall we move on to our armchair engineering section then? In this episode, we're going to talk about weaponry, or what weapons we would possibly like to use if ever we built a robot. So I don't know if you want to kick us off here, Ryan, or...
As is so often the case, I've massively overcomplicated my answer.
Oh, God.
I've separated this into 2 sort of broad areas. One is my answer if I had the money and skills that I don't have. The other is an answer for my current kind of skills and budget. Although my current budget would be roughly 0, so I'm giving myself something reasonable in mind. But I'm not sort of working at the level where I'd be bringing a spare everything.
Okay.
I kind of want to start on the limited end first, because I think that's probably the more interesting answer. And as I think you already know, I'm quite a big fan of control bots. So that's the kind of thing I would want to build. I'm especially thinking down the kind of complete control line of thinking from BattleBots, if that rings any bells to you.
Not immediately. Give me a second, I'll go look it up.
So complete control has basically got a clampy lifter, which behind it then has a large flamethrower. So the idea is they use the clamp to hold something still while they damage it.
This is the robot that lifted a robot up and then heated it to the point that it was almost melting.
Yes, a bombshell, which completely deserved it, and I hate.
Yes. That's an impressive robot. When you said complete control, I didn't immediately register that as a name of a robot. I was expecting you to reference that Ladybird robot that was also in BattleBots.
Tensamushi, no thank you.
Which would have surprised me.
It's gimmick. So I'm trying to think of how to do that in a way that Robot Wars would allow. So you've also got, I think it's Red Devil in BattleBots, which has a kind of clamp and saw. Mm-hmm. But if you're doing that, you're basically dead metal.
Yeah.
I would really want to take a look at the viability of some kind of clamp and drill system, because a drill would not work on a moving target. That's just gonna snap. If you can hold something still and drill it, if nothing else, you know, if I made that and I took it to Robot Wars, if that worked once, I'd be going home happy.
I'm reminded of the drill in the Robot Wars games, which was a drill that just sort of went in and out while spinning. And because of the limitations of the game engine, you could just sort of basically poke a robot a few times, then just huge chunks of armor would come flying off.
Yeah. And part of my thinking with this is that obviously a lot of robots don't use particularly hefty armor on the top. So if you look at something like Concussion, that's just polycarbonate on the top.
Yeah.
So you don't necessarily need that much power and force to get through that. And if you are building with a limited budget and limited skills, you can't necessarily make something very powerful, but you can make something reasonably precise.
Yeah, I mean, given that you can probably buy handheld drill, like cordless drills, that are capable in the right circumstances of drilling through metal. You know, if you got a reasonable like metal drill bit and stuck it on one of those motors and stuff, you could probably do stuff. I think the problem is you'd have to like drill all the way through and then quite a lot more, I think, to cause any damage.
Potentially, it depends where you hit. The way I see this sort of robot idea as much as anything is that it's going to win you some judges' decisions, which isn't necessarily the way you want to go in thinking about it, but I'm not very good at building robots, so that's my first goal. I also think that if you have that clamping system, that alone is enough to potentially win you a fight if you're looking to pit something or take it into danger.
Yeah, fair enough.
So that is my response.
Yeah, that is an interesting thing. I'm trying to think, so like, if my answer... I was just going to talk about one weapon that I would love to do, but I guess the difference between current budget Sam and unlimited money Sam would just be the scale of the power involved, I guess.
So what is your big and terrifying idea?
I think similar to you, I'd be interested to do a robot that's got some capability of pinning a robot down. Mm-hmm. But my love is spinners. I really like them, and I would, as cliched as it is at this point, I would build one. So what I would like to do is a robot that's got some kind of control mechanism. I mean, this almost certainly won't fit in the weight allowance, just to be clear. I don't know how this would work. I don't know. I don't know how to scale this down to something, but I'd try and do some kind of clamping thing. It'd probably end up being something that looks a bit like Dead Metal's kind of claw things, but with a lot more holes in them, and probably made out of something like aluminium, probably quite weak, just to keep them lightweight. But just something just so I can hold a robot a little bit, and then, as I described in the last episode, some kind of flywheel probably that can be actuated in and out of the side of the robot, so it can be enclosed within the robot to be spun up so that you can't have a robot that stays on your weapon, so you've got no time to spin it up. You can just bring it inside you and get it up to whatever ridiculous speed you want, and then push it out to deliver a blow. I think that's an idea that fascinates me to try.
I don't want this to be a hostile and critical environment, but what's the point of holding them still if you've just got a flywheel weapon?
I feel like it would inflict more damage. This is the thing. Like, if you can hold them, I mean, you're going to do a lot more damage to yourself as well, so maybe this isn't the right approach, but so much of the energy is absorbed by them flying away. If you can prevent that, then that'd be cool. I mean, maybe it wouldn't be that you hold them in the middle of the arena. I'm just thinking, like, tactically, I'd probably want to sort of be able to hold them a little bit, shove them into a corner or against a wall or something like that, and then I can deliver the blow where they haven't got anywhere to go, which means that much more of the energy from the flywheel is delivered into damaging their robot. I'd also think, just as an aside, in terms of how do you deliver more energy to a thing, you're allowed to build hovercrafts in Robot Wars. It's within the rules to have a hovercraft robot, which is not what you'd want to do for a robot with a flywheel. But I would think it'd be really funny to do the inverse of that, have a robot that is airtight underneath it, that you can then suction yourself to the floor with.
You're laughing. This happens in Antweight. This is something that has been done.
So I would love to do this on full scale. So if you can imagine, like I said, a lot of the energy when you've got a flywheel, a lot of it goes into sending the other robot flying, and a lot of it goes into sending yourself flying. So if you can pin them against a wall and then pin yourself to the floor and then deliver a blow with a flywheel, almost all of that energy is going, well, I'd say fairly close to half of it is going into your opponent, and the other half is being absorbed internally in whatever ridiculous structure you'd need inside to deal with that kind of energy.
I think that's the kind of system that would work really well for something like a hammer or an axe as well.
Yeah.
If you just applied it at the rear of the robot.
Yeah. I'm trying to think, if you could
Or would it be, hang on, no, would it be the front that you want? No, it'd be the front you wanted it on, wouldn't it?
You want it to hold the front down when you were firing the axe. I'm also thinking this would be an interesting defense against spinners as well, in terms of like spinner killers. If you can create a vacuum under your robot quickly enough and you can react quickly enough, when someone like Carbide is coming towards you, if you just suction yourself to the floor and have sufficiently strong armor, a whole heck of a lot more energy than they expect is going to go back through their robot. And I wonder if you're designing a flywheel weapon, a spinning weapon, you're probably designing that bearing in mind that half the energy is going to go into, or a chunk of the energy is going into sending your opponent flying. And if your opponent doesn't go flying, that energy's got to go somewhere. And if you've got a sufficiently tough armor, like a really thick layer of Hardox or something, then that will all go back through you. And I think it's more likely to start breaking chains and making the weapon drive motors be dislodged and stuff like that.
What you've just described is a limpet.
Yeah, that'd be really funny. A limpet with a spinning thing. But the key for me is I would want a retractable flywheel, I think, with big chunks on the side of it. Something similar to Aftershock's disc, but sideways, and then that whole disc moves in and out like a CD, you know?
Interesting, because when I was sort of looking at my fully skilled, fully budgeted thing, I of course went for spinners.
Yeah, they're the obvious choice.
And I think that a big horizontal bar right now is pretty much the option to go with, because it gives you the best of sort of all worlds in terms of reach, in terms of being invertible as well. It just kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
But you know me, I'm not going to make the thing that's there purely to win and is the optimal design. I'll be making something like a drum, because they're just more fun to me.
Yeah, I think if I were...
And I think they're more visually impressive because they can hit something and keep on hitting it and keep on hitting it. For me, the thing that really epitomises what a drum does, and I'm referencing BattleBots a lot here, which might not be the best thing, but Minosaur versus Blacksmith, where it's just taking it apart piece by piece and it sparks everywhere. That's the kind of thing I want to be making happen. That's the kind of thing I want to be... How can I put this? This is the kind of thing that I want to be making happen so that it can be put on TV for people to enjoy.
I think that's just the big difference between us, is that if I were to enter this show, I would be there to win. And because I'm a competitive person, and I would not innovate for the sake of innovation. I would not try to do a robot that's going to be a spectacular thing to watch. I would build a robot that is just designed to do as much damage as possible and to not tear itself apart. And I'm not saying that my current thoughts on doing that are correct. I feel like if I did what I just described, I'd have huge problems with not destroying myself. So that's probably not the correct approach. But
whereas again, drums seem to do a good job of avoiding that issue as well.
I mean, so they have built into them, they have the advantage of what I'm trying to capture, which is that all the energy is going into the other robot. Because obviously if they're with a drum spinner, they're spinning backwards, so that it sends the other robot up, which means that you've got nowhere to go. You're not sending yourself flying, which means, you're not wasting energy moving yourself. It's all
You're
going
braced
into,
against the ground.
Yeah, exactly. You're going into the other thing, whereas what I'm describing is probably a slightly more complicated way of achieving that goal of grappling a robot and pinning it against the wall before you fire your weapon at it.
And the good thing with the drum is that you can capture that set of physics almost and pack a lot of weight into it while still being invertible.
Yeah.
So doing that with a vertical bar or a vertical disc has a lot of downsides to it, whereas the drum is a good set of compromises.
Yeah.
Something I'd really like to do with the drum as well. You like to talk about sort of standard drum spinner body shape. I'd want to do that, but I'd want to make the drum reversible so that if I'm inverted, I've still got that uppercut happening.
Yeah.
I'd also, and this is where I may be getting into silly territory, I'd like to investigate whether it's possible to, instead of mounting the bar so that it's sandwiched between bodywork on both ends, I wonder if you could mount a bar so that it's sort of attached more centrally, so that there's a sort of end to it that is exposed and rotating.
What do you mean, like having a drum sticking out the left-hand side of your robot? Is that what you mean?
Well, both sides, ideally, but yeah.
Ah, so it'd be, yes, like spinning over.
So that there's still some danger there. So if you're up against a big bar spinner or something that would most often be trying to come in and hit those mounting points, that's much harder to do.
There's probably no reason you couldn't do that. I mean, that'd be, so it'd have to be well in front of your, not well, it'd be in front of your wheels. You'd probably want like a belt system in the middle of your drum, and then you'd have a gap. You'd have like, you know, so similar to Pulsar's thing, where you've got these two rings almost that catch on a robot, and then the belt's in the middle, and then the axle would extend further, and you'd have the bearings that are smaller, and then two or more of those wheel bits that Pulsar has, you know what I mean, with the bit that catches the other robot, just two more of those further out as well.
Yeah, two more toothed bits, basically.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I'm thinking.
You could definitely
I'm not
do
sure
that.
if there's any benefit to it, but again, it's a nice piece of innovation that has a useful idea behind it.
You've got much more attack surface area, which is probably going to be a good thing.
There is one other weapon system that I'd love to see used more.
Yeah?
Which I think this is the place to discuss. And that is crushers. Because you've said many times that you're a big Razor fan.
Yes.
And I think basically everyone that was around at that time is a big Razor fan. And I think it's fairly clear at this point that trying to go through the armours that a lot of robots use now, probably not going to happen.
Could you imagine if you could, though? Just imagine a situation where you're fighting. Did you say like Foxic has a ridiculous amount of armour on it, doesn't it? Can you imagine building a crusher that is capable of going through that? Imagine like you've got a robot with 10 mil of Hardox on top of it, and you still get through it. That would be so much more impressive than the spinners, almost, in some ways.
It's just so much more brutal, isn't it, when it's a slow, sustained, visceral attack.
It's got a sense of inevitability to it, you know. It's just like, that's it. It's just, I agree. I completely agree. I would love to see more crushers that do work.
And of course, I think the big difficulty you've got with the crusher is that all of the power that you're exerting on that opponent, you've got to withstand yourself. So I wonder if something like Can Opener, made to modern standards, might be really effective. Because instead of bracing against your own bodywork, you're bracing against another crushing surface. Are you quickly looking up what Can Opener looks like?
Perhaps.
Spelt with a K, just so you know. More bite than a great white. Which is probably true, because great whites actually have very low power in their jaws. They're slicing teeth, not crushing.
I mean, so I've just Googled Can Opener robot, and my first hit is Can Opener is a fictional competitive robot in the video game Robot Wars Extreme Destruction. So have I gone for the wrong... You said it's spelled with a K?
Yeah.
Can Opener robot. Oh, that looks interesting.
It's a very good live tour robot.
Interesting. I like the look of that.
And I do wonder if with a design like that, even if you're not going through that armour, if you had enough force on that, surely you could start bending panels, maybe even sort of damaging the welding that's in there as well. I think there's a lot of potential in a good crusher if you can make it strong enough.
I think that's the thing, like its strength, and then the strength of the materials, but also like strength in terms of how much force it can exert. And I think the big problem with it, the biggest problem to me, is that the more crushing power you have, the slower your weapon moves. These things have an inverse relationship almost of, you know, the faster your weapon is going, the less torque it has, the less consistent pressure it can apply.
I have heard rumours of a robot that entered Series 10, I don't know if it made it in or not, that kind of uses a two-stage system.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking.
So first of all, it's pneumatic to get the first grip, and then hydraulic to push from there. But I'm struggling to envisage how that would work in practice. Because presumably, if you've got a pneumatic system, taking it to its first sort of stage of closedness, you've then got to push against something with the hydraulics, but surely you'd be pushing against the pneumatic system almost.
Yeah.
Unless it was somehow locking in place and you were then using the hydraulics from there. I'm not entirely certain how that would work yet.
No, I can't immediately see how that would work, I'll be honest. But that's exactly the kind of thing I'd try to do. If I were to build a crusher, I would try to make it two-stage in some way. I'd try to give it a quick kind of get enough of a grip and then exert more after that. Be hard to do, though.
If there's one thing we know for sure, we are not the people to do any of this. We are not skilled enough. But maybe that ant weight will come to fruition one day, probably with something really boring and safe like a lifter.
I'd just love to have something that moves. I think that would be really cool. I'd be happy with just the drivetrain and that's it.